For the first time during this rising tension between Canada and the United States, the resistance isn't just coming from Canada anymore. It's now emerging from inside the United States itself. Influential voices within the American system are openly questioning whether this approach, this language, this ongoing escalation is actually hurting their own economy more than it is putting pressure on Canada. And that shift matters. Because the moment a strategy starts damaging your own side, it stops being leverage and starts becoming a liability.
Tourism is the second largest industry, both by revenue, and it supports 70,000 jobs. Canada has long been our largest share of foreign visitors, but last year we saw a 30% drop in Canadian tourism, largely due to the loss of trust and goodwill because of this administration's rhetoric around Canada. Secretary Letnick, last week you said about Canada's economic strategy, and I quote, "They suck." How does insulting our closest ally and neighbor help the businesses in my state of New Hampshire and states all across this country who are hurting because of the loss of Canadian business and tourism?
Canada's economy leans on the incredible $30 trillion economy of America. But
there's no doubt about that, Mr. Secretary. But insulting our closest ally and neighbor who provides a lot of business, we have a lot of businesses in New Hampshire, small businesses who work on both sides of the border. We have all those Canadian visitors who are not coming because of your comments and comments by the administration. How does that help our economy?
It is outrageous that Canada will not put U.S. spirits on the shelf. It is insulting.
It is.
And disrespectful to America that they won't
Absolutely.
even put...
And my husband has an interest in a company that has American spirits. And they won't do it because of the insults from this president and comments like yours. So I want to go on to another question.
But can I have just one small comment, which is dairy is treated so badly, and your state cares about dairy, and we are trying desperately to get them to live to the deal that they have on USMCA and stop treating our dairy farmers so poorly, and your state cares about that, and we are fighting for that.
We do, but we are not going to get agreement when we keep insulting people. When we have allies and partners, we should try and work with them, not insult them. And I find your rhetoric insulting to the people in my state who are working so hard to try and ensure that they can do business.
Before we break this down further, subscribe to Canada Today for sharp, fact-based analysis on the issues shaping Canada's future. Tourism is one of the largest industries, generating massive revenue and supporting around 70,000 jobs. For years, Canada has been the biggest source of foreign visitors, but last year, Canadian tourism dropped by nearly 30%. A major reason? A breakdown in trust and goodwill, driven by the administration's rhetoric toward Canada. During a recent exchange, a senior U.S. lawmaker raised a critical point, questioning how insulting America's closest ally could possibly benefit local businesses, especially in border states like New Hampshire, that rely heavily on Canadian visitors. The concern was straightforward but powerful. If Canadian tourists stop coming, if cross-border business slows down, who actually pays the price? The answer: local economies, small businesses, and workers across the United States. Yet the response from officials doubled down on complaints, focusing on trade disputes like restrictions on American products, rather than addressing the bigger issue: damaging a key economic relationship. What happened in Washington wasn't just political disagreement, it was visible frustration, a direct challenge to the logic behind this strategy, not from a diplomatic angle but from an economic one. And the reality is already clear. This isn't theoretical anymore. The effects are measurable: fewer Canadian visitors, declining revenue in U.S. border regions, and a steady erosion of trust between two deeply connected economies. This has moved beyond messaging. This is now about real economic consequences. A drop in Canadian tourism isn't just a number, it's a direct hit. Businesses lose income, Jobs are impacted. Entire regional economies feel the strain. What makes this situation even more striking is that this damage isn't coming from global crises or structural changes. It's being driven by tone, by a deliberate strategy that treats allies more like adversaries. And when the harm begins to come from your own actions, a serious question emerges. What is the actual objective? The assumption behind this approach has always been simple. Apply enough pressure and the other side will eventually give in. But that only works when the pressure is controlled, strategic, and precise. What we're seeing instead is something very different. Pressure without discipline, rhetoric without a clear plan. And that doesn't create leverage, it creates instability. Because when trust is weakened, the entire relationship weakens, not just one side. And that reality is now being acknowledged within the United States itself, not as political opinion, but as economic fact. On the other side, Canada's position has become more defined, not less. The message coming from its leadership is clear. Canada will not make concessions just to start a conversation. It will not agree to terms that don't serve its workers, businesses, and long-term interests. Because experience has already shown what happens when concessions are made without balance. You give something up, and the demands don't stop. That isn't negotiation. That's escalation disguised as diplomacy. Refusing to engage in that model isn't stubbornness, it's strategy. Another key issue being debated is the idea that Canada must make concessions just to even enter negotiations. But that idea misunderstands leverage entirely. Leverage isn't something you hand over at the beginning, it's something you use during the process. There's also a persistent narrative that Canada depends heavily on the United States. But that story is incomplete. The relationship goes both ways. The United States relies on Canada for critical resources, energy, agriculture, raw materials, and supply chain stability. These aren't optional connections. They're built into the structure of both economies. So when that relationship is strained, the impact is never one-sided. And that's what makes the current strategy coming out of Washington so contradictory. It tries to project strength, while at the same time weakening the very systems that support that strength. As trade discussions approach, this contradiction becomes even clearer. Demanding concessions before talks even begin, essentially an entry fee, undermines the entire concept of negotiation. Canada's refusal to accept that framework sends a strong signal. This is no longer a country reacting under pressure. This is a country negotiating from a position of confidence, fully aware of its own strengths and the flaws in the strategy being used against it. What we're witnessing right now isn't just a diplomatic disagreement, it's a strategic miscalculation playing out in real time. Because when your own policies start hurting your economy, when your own lawmakers begin questioning your approach, and when your closest allies start pulling away instead of moving closer, that's not strength. That's a sign something isn't working. And the longer this continues, the clearer it becomes. This strategy isn't forcing Canada to back down. It's forcing the United States to face the consequences of its own actions. Subscribe to Canada Today for daily, in-depth analysis of the moments shaping Canada's future.